Good evening. My name is Esther Park, and I am the Vice President of Programming at Ulite Arts in Miami, welcoming you all to Talks in partnership with Locust Projects. We are live on Facebook, so tell your friends, share the link, and make sure to say hi in the chat. We'd love to know where you're logging in from. And I know some of you guys are logging in from LA. Let's not go there about the playoffs. We get it. Okay, so tonight we are so excited to welcome the magical Erin Christovale. But before I bring her on, a couple quick housekeeping notes. There will be a live Q&A after Erin's presentation that will be moderated by Locust Project's Executive Director, Lori Mertes. So if you have any questions for Erin, please put those questions in the chat, and we will do our best to get them answered. Also, shameless Ulite plug, but this exact time, next Wednesday, the Ellies will be happening live. What is the Ellies, you ask? Named after Ulite's founder, Ellie Schneiderman, the Ellies is Miami's annual visual arts award, where we give out up to $500,000 to working individual artists in our community. Over 500 applicants applied this year, and next Wednesday, we'll be announcing the 48 amazing artists who will be taking home an Ellie. So invite some friends over, socially distanced, of course, put on a fancy outfit, it is an award ceremony after all, and log on onto theellies.org next Wednesday, October 21st at 7 p.m. and find out who won an Ellie. Okay, now back to Erin. Erin is the Associate Curator at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles and the co-founder of the experimental film program Black Radical Imagination with Amir George. She has curated such groundbreaking exhibitions such as Awake in the Water, Meditations on Disaster at the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art, Memoirs of a Watermelon Woman and a Subtle Likeness at the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives, and co-curated Made in LA for the Hammer Museum's biennial with Anne Ellegood. Recent projects include solo presentation of artist and filmmaker Jamilah Gary, as well as former Ulite resident artist Jamilah Sabur. Erin has also organized and curated many film programs, including the ongoing Black Radical Imagination Project, as well as the Let It Be Known, which is part of the Clock Shop's Radio Imagination, a series of programs and artist commissions exploring the legacy of Octavia E. Butler. I'm sure Erin will discuss all this and much more during her presentation. So without further ado, please help me welcome to the virtual stage, Erin Christovale.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you to everyone who's tuning in tonight. I really appreciate it. I just want to first shout out Ulite Arts, Locust Projects, Dennis, Esther, and Lori for making this possible. This Curator Talk series has been really influential to me, so it's an honor to be a part of the group. So tonight I'm going to talk about a few things. I think for me, when I do these talks, it's always important for me to sort of talk about my curatorial history and trajectory and what I'm interested in, because it's not necessarily traditional. And I'd like to start off with that and sort of start with the film programming aspect of my curatorial practice, and then I'll get into some of my exhibitions. I think for me, what my curatorial practice is centered in is the notion of a Black radical tradition. I am constantly mining the archives and, looking through and researching legacies of whom I consider to be Black radicals, whether they be artists, writers, filmmakers, and sort of pulling from, their brilliance to produce the work that I do. So you'll kind of see that trickled out throughout. So we'll start with the first slide. So we'll go back one slide. Okay, great. So I love to start off with this slide because this is an image of Native Thinghood. It was the first collective that I was a part of back in 2012. And this is a group of friends. We had all just graduated from undergrad in LA, and we all came together from sort of different fields to really think through how can we build a space that supports and promotes artists of color in the city. I think at the time we weren't really seeing emerging artists of color entering the larger institutions or being reflected there. And so we sort of took it upon ourselves to create that space. A lot of that work was really in sort of exploring and experimenting together. We hosted several talks. We, created gallery shows. And then one of the other aspects of that collective was film programming. And I sort of led the film programming aspect. And so, I had just come out of film school at USC, and this kind of felt like the next logical step. And so it was a really sort of the beginning place where I got my feet wet to really understand how to put a film program together, and sort of led me into the Black radical imagination, which is the next slide. So the Black radical imagination was an experimental film program of visual shorts focusing on new media, video art, and experimental narrative of filmmakers and visual artists within the African diaspora. This was a film program that started in 2012 with filmmaker Amir George, who's based in Chicago. And for us, I think we started this program for several reasons. I think at the time we were both deeply invested in the philosophy of Afrofuturism and thinking about, what is a sort of contemporary understanding of Afrofuturism. And so for us, sort of both existing in the cinematic realm, we were really interested in seeing what that meant in the cinematic realm. So at the time, there were several things happening digitally. You had sort of the introduction of the webisode series. A lot of us were watching Awkward Black Girl. You had, the introduction of crowdsourcing, thinking about Kickstarter and the various Black independent filmmakers it supported. And so we were really looking to the digital realm as a new space and as a space where, these filmmakers and artists could operate freely, sort of, either outside of the sort of standards or constraints of the art world or the film industry, and sort of create, a new space for their audience. And so we thought, this was very futuristic. We were also thinking about, in terms of the title, Black Radical Imagination, we were reading Freedom Dreams, Black Radical Imagination by Robin D.G. Kelley, which is an incredible book. Robin D.G. Kelley is a scholar based in LA, which basically outlines several Black liberation movements and sort of comes back to the notion that, if we didn't have the capacity to imagine new futures, to imagine space outside of oppression, that we wouldn't, all of these movements basically would have ceased to exist. And so he really sort of emphasizes the radical notion of imagination. And we thought that that was sort of a centerpiece of what we wanted to express in the cinematic realm. So next slide. So basically what we did is we assembled these film programs every year that were about an hour long, and each program had a theme. So the first program that we did the theme was Afrofuturism. And we basically gathered together several experimental short films and sort of, basically created a program out of the theme. So, initially we were just thinking that we would do this in LA and Chicago, but we put together a trailer and it really sort of took off online, and, various art organizations and museums reached out to us. And so, this sort of initial pull into this, I think, pushed the program, and, the program went on for, 6 or 7 years. We traveled internationally. It really sort of became its own force. And it also sort of built an incredible collective, I think, of Black radical thinkers and moving image makers that came together under this program. So I'm just going to show you a quick trailer for the 2015 program, which featured Jatavia Gary, Colleen Smith, Terrence Nance, and Lauren Kelly. So we did these trailers every year, and yeah, it was amazing. I think towards the end of this project, we ended up passing it on to some other film programmers. And, you know, I think, again, just sort of emphasizing a Black radical tradition as something that is cyclical, as something that is passed down, as something that is legacy. And so I think we really wanted to embody that notion. So the first exhibition I curated was actually back in 2014 at Mokata in Brooklyn. They were doing a call for curators over the summer, a call for proposals. And I submitted an all film and video show called Awake in the Water, Meditations on Disaster. This show was highly personal to me because I was thinking so much about my family, who is based just outside of New Orleans, and thinking about Hurricane Katrina and sort of the ongoing effects and aftermath of that disaster. And also with that, the sort of lack of support that was being given to Black communities. So from there, you know, I was really thinking about this juxtaposition of, you know, these various natural disasters that had affected predominantly Black communities in recent years. So not only Hurricane Katrina, but the BP oil spill and also the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. But then I was also thinking in a more futuristic sense. And I was thinking about, you know, all of the films that were circulating at that time, these sort of dystopic or apocalyptic films in which the protagonists would always be white men. And it just made me think, you know, what would it mean for the protagonist to be a Black woman? You know, what other things would she be up against? What other constructs would she be facing? And so from there, I basically assembled a group of works. So in this front room that you kind of see here on either side, you see two works. On the left, you have a piece by Tamika Norris. On the right, you have a piece by Kevin Jerome Everson. And then in the back there, that's sort of the apocalyptic dystopic area. And that was a piece called Ditch Plains by Loretta Farnholz. So what was really interesting about this exhibition is I got to explore a lot. You know, I got to include works that, you know, were actually in some cases found footage from YouTube. And so it was a really interesting sort of first foray in curating. And for me, it was really thinking through, you know, terms like environmental racism, terms like environmental justice, and thinking about how those terms relate to each other, thinking about natural disaster. And, you know, of course, I can only think about the various natural disasters that we're dealing with right now. Obviously in LA, we're dealing with sort of the aftermath of the fires. And, you know, historically, what communities just do not receive the support that they should, the civic support that they should. So this was really interesting, like cramming a bunch of video works into like a very small space. I learned a lot. But it was definitely sort of the first introduction where I was like, you know, I'm really interested in curating. So this was the beginning. So we'll go to the next slide. So from there, I had an opportunity, and all of this was as an independent curator. I was approached by Cheryl Dunye, who's an incredible filmmaker, who's actually worked on several TV shows at this point. I think she recently did an episode of Lovecraft Country. But Cheryl Dunye she approached a collective of curators back in 2016 because it was the 20th anniversary of her 1996 film, A Watermelon Woman. And she wanted to celebrate by thinking about, the archive of that film and thinking about the legacy of that film, but also thinking about that film as sort of a seminal piece of new queer cinema in the 1990s. And so she invited us to access her archive and just sort of do what we will with it. And so from there, I worked with the One and Gay Lesbian archives at the USC libraries. And I thought that site was important because it's one of the few, queer archives in the city. But it was also interesting to sort of look through and interrogate that archive and understand that it was a predominantly white archive and that there's very little room for POC folks. And so this sort of felt like a disruption to that archive to bring Cheryl in this way. And as you can see here, this vitrine sort of represents, I think, various parts of her archive. You can see, obviously, the magazines that were coming out at the time, her director hat, a sort of call log of people. She won the Teddy Award here, as you can see there. And this was really incredible to just have her archive available in this space. I think that, this film was really important, and I think a very important site for my curatorial practice and thinking about archives in non-traditional ways. The film is actually about a young lesbian filmmaker who's in search of this actress from some old race films. And she makes this incredible discovery at the end, and there's this plot twist. And it really sort of points to, this notion of biomythography, Audre Lorde's notion of biomythography, or sort of making your own archive. So we'll go to the next slide. So I also had the option of curating another show in tandem with the Memoirs of a Watermelon Woman, and this show was called A Subtle Likeness. And this show really featured a group of young queer contemporary artists who were thinking through some of the same themes as Cheryl in the film. And so here you see 2 large-scale prints by Paul Sepuya, and then on the right here, a piece by Candace Williams. This was really, I think, interesting and important to this notion, again, of legacy building, sort of building off of an original piece. And it was just really great to see the response. There's a piece down there at the bottom, which is actually a zine that Candace Williams made in response to the archive. And it basically displays several images of white women actresses at points of hysteria. So sort of pointing at this dissonance between that archive and, again, Cheryl's archive. So we'll keep going. Next slide. So from there, I was invited by Visual Aids to co-curate their 28th anniversary of A Day Without Art. This is a video program and a larger project that they do every day on December 1st in remembrance of the AIDS epidemic and the ongoing epidemic. And so I co-curated this program, this film program, with Vivian Crockett, and it was called Alternative Endings, Radical Beginnings. For us, I think it was really important to highlight, obviously, I think, the Black queer cultural production that was responding to this epidemic. Back in 2016, 44% of all new HIV diagnoses in the United States were Black folks. And so for us, it was a really important space to sort of make the point that, this epidemic isn't over. It disproportionately affects certain communities that don't have proper access to healthcare. And what we assembled was a really incredible group of artists and filmmakers, this intergenerational group that I think sort of holistically responded to this moment. So we're going to show a quick trailer, and the works, as you can see here, featured Mickey Blanco, Tourmaline, Kia LaBeija, Brontes Purnell, Thomas Allen Harris, Tiana Nakia McLauden, Cheryl Dunye, and Ellen Spiro. So I think that, that film program for me was actually, I think, one of the hardest things I've ever done, because I think the subject matter was so real and so visceral, and, had clearly affected such a large community that it was difficult. But I'll say, like, the artists and the filmmakers who were a part of it just produced incredible work. And I was really thankful to be a part of that project. So from there, we enter Made in LA 2018. So I was invited by the Hammer Museum in LA to co-curate the 2018 biennial Made in LA. Made in LA is Los Angeles's big biennial, and I co-curated the show with Anne Ellegood. This was a really important, I think, moment in my career in which, as you can see, before this, I was a largely independent curator. I'd never considered working at an institution. I was kind of just, going between independent exhibitions and film programs. And so this was, I think, a moment for me in which I was able to step into a larger institution, and to take on, an official role in that institution. So Made in LA was like a massive, massive undertaking. And, each Made in LA is different. It's been going since 2012. And so I think for Anne and I, so you have to remember that we started this in 2016, or, shortly after 2016. So right after that election and inauguration. And so we were looking at a political landscape that was quickly changing. And we wanted to respond to that. And I think in terms of the group of artists that we assembled for this show, we wanted to look at Los Angeles as a site, a sort of a microsite or micro representation for the nation. And so at that time, and this is still ongoing, LA was going through a lot of changes. The cultural landscape was changing, the infrastructure was changing. Obviously, gentrification was a major issue, still is. And so we wanted to respond to all of that. And I think what you'll see in terms of the artists who are represented in this show is that their works weren't necessarily reacting to the moment per se, or reacting to our political climate, but these were artists who I think had been responding to these socio-political issues for, all of their practice. And so another point that I think was really important for us was to think about diversity in a myriad of ways. I think For us, we wanted this notion of diversity to really represent LA as a city, as a multicultural landscape, and not so much diversity in art world standards, which I feel is a bit different. So what you have from that, I think, is what we ended up including 32 artists. And this was after over 200 studio visits all throughout LA County. And it was just an amazing process. I mean, going to 6 studio visits a day, 5 times a week, really just exploring the varied practices throughout the city. It was such, I think, an important moment for me, especially as someone who's grown up, I grew up in Long Beach and LA County, and really wanting to sort of write a love letter to my city in a sense. So this is one of the works here. This is E.J. Hill, Excellentia Molitia Victoria. And E.J.'s piece, I think, was the most challenging in the best way, because E.J. is a Los Angeles artist born and raised here, and is known for doing these durational performances. But at the time, he was really working with a lot of, photography and sculpture and installation. And so when we carved out this space in our vault gallery for him, we thought that, it would be more of like an environment that you would engage with. And maybe about a month before the show opened, EJ approached us and he was like, I have this idea. I need to do this performance, and I need to do it throughout the run of the exhibition. And so this piece for EJ is really responding to his educational experience in the city. EJ attended 7 different schools, and he actually got his MFA from UCLA. And this piece is really thinking through sort of beyond the, educational experience that we receive in these spaces. What are our social experiences? What are our formative experiences? And, how do these academic spaces, respond to folks of color, to Black and Brown youth? And so this, I think, was a piece that so many people related to. And basically what EJ did is, through the run of the show, he stood on this pedestal every day and throughout our opening hours throughout. So basically what that meant is, he took no breaks. He didn't eat, he didn't use the restroom, and sometimes he would be standing on that pedestal for up to 6 to 7 hours every day. And so this was a really interesting, I think, experience for me as a curator in sort of switching this notion of caretaking for objects and caretaking for a person. And so every day I would come in there and I would sort of orbit around him. And, we would see a range of responses. People would come in and instantly start sobbing. People would come to the foot of his pedestal and pray to him. People would deliver him flowers and fruit. There was a group of people that came in and did Reiki with him. It was such an incredible experience. And there were so many incredible artists in that show. I'm thinking about Lauren Halsey and Diedrich Brackens, even Luchita Hurtado, who just recently passed away, Daniel Joseph Martinez. It really was a full representation of the city. And I think, one of my proudest moments. We'll go to the next slide. And as I mentioned here, this is the piece that Lauren Halsey did, the Crenshaw District Hieroglyphic Project. So this is another work that was really interesting because Lauren made this as a prototype for a piece that she wanted to display as like a public art piece in South Central LA. And at the time she, was trying to get in touch with the city. She had this idea. And what she did was essentially she built this work in order for the city to see it at the Hammer. And, this was also just an incredible piece, just the scale of it. You can't really see in the image here, but she basically inscribed images and street names and people who have passed away all over these panels that you see here. And these are all sort of symbols of South Central, the space that she was born and raised in. And I also just want to talk about EJ and Lauren very quickly, because I think beyond this recognition in the show, they've both gone on to do incredible work in thinking about community. Lauren currently has a community center called Summit Everything, and she delivers fresh produce to various neighborhoods and communities in South Central. And EJ Hill is working with the Tamir Rice Foundation to think about incorporating arts within that foundation. And so, I think these two artists in particular, who were born and raised in LA and sort of their works directly respond to LA, are very much thinking about community, which is something that I think I also echo in my practice. So we'll go to the next slide. So from there, I got invited to, permanently work at the Hammer. And my first Hammer project, Hammer projects are a series that we do where we work within our small galleries. And it's basically one artist, one curator to sort of realize a new project. And, when it came time for me to do my first Hammer project, I immediately thought of Jamilah. Because, Jamilah actually had shown in a Black Radical Imagination program that we did, and I was just following her work and so fascinated by the ways in which she really thinks about the Caribbean as a diaspora, but also as a geographic, futuristic space, a space that sort of spans or goes beyond time and space. And so I was really interested in working with her on realizing this new project that you see here, Un Chemin Escarpe, a steep escarpment. And it was just an incredible collaboration. I mean, what you see here is a 5-channel video installation that she did. And it responds to different sites in the Caribbean. It's thinking about the Blue Mountains in Jamaica. It's thinking about the Caribbean Sea that produces this whistle sound, just sort of various natural components of the Caribbean to sort of put it together. So this was, I think incredible. And I think this was a first time in a way where Jamilah, had the space to really expand in this way and to think about her work with multiple channels. And so that was really great to sort of realize that together. We'll go to the next slide. So from there, I worked on another Hammer project. This is with Jatavia Gary. This was actually earlier this year. This piece is called the Giverny Suite, which is a 3-channel video installation project that really is a meditation thinking about the bodily autonomy of Black women. The piece was shot in Giverny, France, and also in Harlem, New York. And sprinkled within it is found footage and source footage of various moments and various performers. As you can see in the back here, we see Nina Simone singing Feelings at the Montreux Jazz Festival in the 70s. And so again, this was another really incredible work. I feel like Jatavia, again, was also a part of a Black Radical Imagination, where I got to work with some of these filmmakers and artists, I think, in a new way, to think about installation, to think about the environment, and to collaborate together. And so this piece, I think, was truly a force. What you can't see here are 2 altars dedicated to Oshun and Yemaya. And so as soon as you entered the space, you sort of felt blessed by their presences. And you were also just immediately sort of hit by Nina's face as she sings this very emotional, triggering version of Feelings. I think in both of these cases, both of these Hammer projects, I think it's important for me to state that I was very intentional about working with Black women. I think that Black women experimental filmmakers are the sort of future of the moving image. The ways in which I think both of these projects display them sort of sourcing together found material, source material, the archive, shot material. I think there's sort of a tapestry. I think about the origins of Black cultural production in this country. And I think so much about quilting as a space where Black women could sort of work together, and how both of these pieces are, these very intricate quilts. In Jamilah's case of the Caribbean as a diaspora, as a region, and Jatavia's case as, a lived experience of a Black woman and the legacy of Black women and performativity and survival and love and death, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll go to the next slide. So from there, I had an opportunity to work with the Hammers collection. And this was the first time that I was looking through our collection, which, mostly tends to focus on Los Angeles-based artists. And at the time, I was actually reading Bell Hook's collection of essays called Belonging, A Culture of Place. And these essays were really sort of set around placemaking and agrarianism, and sort of thinking about the Great Migration, right? This notion of, Black folks leaving a Southern space, leaving a natural space, and moving into urban centers, and what that means for aesthetics, what that means for the psyche, what that means for racial and social constructs. And I was really struck by this book because in one of the chapters in Aesthetics of Blackness, she talks about growing up in what she calls an ugly home. And this home that was largely sort of decorated by her grandmother, was the home in which she came to understand what aesthetics are. And I found this really powerful because it sort of rooted me back in, this trip that I would do every year as a child. I would go back to Louisiana. I would stay with my grandma for the summer. And it was this very distinct sort of differentiation between, growing up in LA, but being in the South, and understanding those histories and connecting with ancestors in this different way. And so, I think this is sort of a sojourn that I think a lot of us make. And, this show was really in honor of that, in honor of Grandma's house, as being potentially the first site, the first museum, the first gallery that you encounter. And thinking about how that, disrupts the pristineness of the museum, the elitism of the museum, the scholarship of the museum, and roots you in a home that's familiar, that's comforting, that's welcoming. And so I basically wanted to build a house in this gallery. And so what you see here, these are several works from our collection, works by Edgar Arsenault, Rodney McMillan, Corey Newkirk, Lorna Simpson, Betty Saar, and Michael Queenland. And incidentally, these are all artists who are based in LA for the most part. And so for me, I was thinking about these larger histories of the Great Migration, but also thinking about objects, the ways in which objects are used, found, appropriated, assembled, and sort of this a tradition also of assemblage sort of coming through in this piece. It's sort of, I think for me, it was again very personal in that I also wanted to create a space within the museum for myself, a space of comfort. And as you can see here, the walls are painted purple, sort of, alluding to the color purple. And so this was a really important collection show for me, and I think sort of continues to evolve in my mind as we go. So we'll keep going. So I wanted to end the talk with actually two projects rather, that I am working towards. So both of these projects are set to open next fall. And so I wanted to talk about them a bit. So this is a piece, a performance work by Ulysses Jenkins called Just Another Rendering of the Same Old Problem. So I'm co-curating a retrospective of Ulysses Jenkins' work next fall with Meg Only, who's at the ICA Philadelphia. And, for us, we were really thinking about, again, I keep coming back to moving image as sort of the centerpiece of my practice. Ulysses is, again, someone who grew up in LA, went to Otis, studied under Charles White and Betty Saar, but also, interestingly enough, Chris Burden and Gene Youngblood, thinking about expanded cinema. And in my eyes, I think he's really one of the pioneering video artists of the 80s, and really thinking about video as a form. And so, the retrospective will feature several of his works and his archive. And yeah, I think it's going to be a great sort of homecoming for him. Next. Okay, thanks. And then this is the final slide. So this is an image of Sylvia Wynter, who is a cultural scholar who is originally from Jamaica, who taught predominantly at Stanford up in the Bay Area. And Wynter's work, I think, is just in many ways starting to come to the surface or to be more accessible. In 2015, Catherine McKittrick, assembled an incredible collection of essays responding to Wynter's work, which was sort of my entry point for understanding her. But the show that I'll be doing this next year will be called No Humans Involved, and it's named after an essay that Wynter wrote. And the show is going to be a group show that's really thinking through, Western modes and constructs of humanism. How can we think of humanism in a more expanded way? How can we sort of push against a notion of man that is often defined by a very Eurocentric 17th century Enlightenment way. And that philosophy and theory is what has informed the Americas and the constructs that we exist within. So it'll really be looking at artists who are disrupting and interrogating this mode of humanism. So that's it. Thank you. And I guess I'll take some questions now.
Hey, Erin, thank you so very much for your talk. It's really wonderful to hear you talk about the trajectory of your career and coming out of a more non-traditional approach to curating, but at the same time, how it really influenced you looking in different places for the work that you do. And I loved hearing the words archive and legacy repeated throughout your talk. I'm just curious, before I jump into some of the questions, I have a question, and your practice being centered in the moving image. I'm wondering about the legacy of being a curator within the context of UCLA and the LA Rebellion. And also perhaps how do you see how the LA Rebellion influence maybe contemporary art practice? And you talk about the influence of women in working in experimental film and the trajectory and their influence on the future. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, yeah, UCLA is very special in that it, produced this incredible crop of predominantly Black filmmakers in the 70s and the 80s called the LA Rebellion. And that basically came out of, I think it was an affirmative action, push in the film department. And so in came, all of these folks of color. And what you have from, I think, that particular moment is, incredible films that, clearly were not defined by the entertainment industry or defined by these sort of linear notions of film, but we're thinking through, vast histories, thinking through, third world cinema or Italian neo-realist cinema. And so, you get this sort of special collection of films that I think are responding to the various neighborhoods. I think of Killer of Sheep by Charles Burnett, or again, thinking about Black womanhood, an incredible piece by Barbara McCullough called Water Ritual. I think these were definitely, the foundations to my practice in viewing those works, and, filmmakers that I still follow and that are still producing.
I just have to add that I just texted Ofunmilayo Makara, who's one of the original members, maybe a less well-known name. I met her in DC and we became friendly, and I told her that you were speaking tonight. So I don't know if you're out there, Makara, but hi. And I learned so much about that legacy of that program, which I knew nothing about as a curator who has been interested in the moving image historically myself, but that history was absent. I'm going to expand outside of UCLA. We have a question. I'm not sure who it's from, but it was one of the first we got. Wondering, how has LA in particular shaped your curating? And maybe how has LA changed for you in your time there?
Oh man,
that's a big one.
Yeah, it's a big one. But I think what I'll start with the history of LA. And one reference I always like to throw out there is Pio Pico, who was sort of one of the last Mexican governors of the state, came originally from Sinaloa, Mexico. And a lot of people don't know that he's of African descent. He was known to dine with Biddy Mason, who was originally an enslaved Black woman who basically walked from the South to Los Angeles with her, whoever owned her at the time. And once she got to Los Angeles, she realized that she was a free woman, but they were trying to hide that from her. And so she actually went to court herself and fought for herself to free herself. She then became one of the biggest real estate moguls in the city, and I believe also opened one of the first AME churches. And so I think like the history of LA it's just rooted in Blackness, it's just like, and, it's like these figures I feel like don't get talked about enough. And, I think they sort of paved the way for, so many folks who came to LA during the Great Migration. I think so much about not only LA, but like the West Coast as this very expansive space. When you think about Black cultural production on the West Coast, I think of experimental jazz, I think of funk soul, I think of experimental film. And I think so much of that informs the work that I do. I think it's, and I think a lot of it actually has to do with, in some ways, our psyches aren't burdened with, I think what the South, the Midwest, and the East Coast have to deal with, these very visual, visceral representations of racism when we think about monuments or certain buildings or certain histories. Obviously, that goes without saying that, the genocide that happened to the Native folks on the West Coast is very prevalent. But I think that the West Coast is a magical space. It's a space that people were courageous enough to go to start a new life or a potential for a new life. And I think the Black folks in this space imbue that, and sort of, this space just allows for a deeper experimentation. And so I think when I started off curating, I didn't know what the hell I was doing, but I knew that, these various legacies and people who have influenced me from LA sort of led me from, show to show and program to program. So.
It's interesting, the sort of similarities, Miami being much younger, but of course is the gateway to the Americas, being a space for reinvention and starting new, but in a younger way. You have now a ton of questions that have just come in, and some are quite long. But I'm going to ask this one to kind of stay within the film for a moment, and I'm going to add a little second part to it. And I'm so sorry because I can't follow along on the chat to see whose questions are in today. And Esther didn't give them to me, but it's all good. So if you want to claim your question, you mentioned the way in which filmography has become a sort of quilting process, and something that is collective, a space where Black women can work together. And their question is that quilting is very accessible. You can do it with a scrap of fabric. And here we are with all these things in our hands that make video and film. And do you think even with this in the accessibility, do you find it is accessible? And if it's not, how can we make it more accessible as a means of expression?
Yeah, I mean, the film production process historically has not been accessible, I think, which is why when we look at our, cinematic history in this country, obviously, Black women are typically excluded, or, just Black folks in general, I think, didn't have the opportunity to truly participate in this process. And so I think about, as you point to the phone here, the access that we have to this process now. Everything can be streamlined to an app. We can shoot with our phones, as you said. But I also think, particularly when I talk about Jamilah and Jatavia, there's something that they're doing in the actual quilting process when you talk about picking up scraps from here and there and different things. They're sourcing found footage, original footage, archive, and bringing them together to make this quilt. And so I think there's something accessible about that, or more accessible, in which, we have the digital realm to find these sources and put them together. And so that's sort of what I mean by the quilting process.
That's interesting. We have a current show, Juana Valdez, who's going to be one of your studio visits, but the idea of quilting, she got to work with an archive, the Wolfson Archive specifically, and collaborate to include some archival footage within her exhibition, and that as a source, then quilting that together. But it was such a transformative experience for both her and even the folks at Wolfson, who haven't had a lot of artists using them as a resource, more filmmakers. So I thought that was very interesting. So the second part of that question, and I actually was wondering that as I was looking through, is Black Radical Imagination still programming? I looked on the site and it looks like I don't see anything coming up.
I think maybe this is like a 2-year break. I mean, that's a good question. I leave that question open. If someone wants to take it on, it's there for the taking. I think the reality is, Amir and I just don't have the capacity to do it anymore. But I think that doesn't mean that it can't take on different iterations or, show up in a different way. Like, we always wanted that program to be this sort of, malleable thing that could turn into an archive or a film program or an exhibition. And I think it will continue to do that. I just don't know when currently.
I did see, though, that one of the years, I think it was 2016, it came to the Art Center, South Florida, which is now Ulite Arts. Exactly. Did you come down for that?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Very cool. What did you think of Miami then?
Oh, it was great. Same,
Sad
same.
We can't have you here in person. Shifting gears a little bit, have you thought about disasters as a lack of policies to protect people of color, disasters and the lack of policies to protect people of color? And, how is that expanding with climate change? They mentioned something about a form of meditation of death and art, and art as an intervention to promote climate justice.
Art as an intervention to promote climate justice.
Yeah, can artists perhaps, and this is the idea of as being transformative catalysts for change, or being somehow have a seat at the table where there's policy making. I think in terms of promoting climate justice, I think artists do have a voice and a role, but I think that's kind of what they're trying to get at. And how can that happen? Talked about your New Orleans connections and having sort of seen that and experienced and seen family members experience that. What is the role art and artists can play?
I mean, I think artists continue to play a role in all of the socio-political issues that we deal with. And I think, that's so important. I think, that show, going back to Awake in the Water, I think what it actually did, even though it was several years after Hurricane Katrina, is it really provided, I think, a new and deeper knowledge of environmental justice and racism. It's like we were talking about the natural disaster and sort of the direct effects that it had on these various communities. But I think at the time that disaster happened, we weren't really, naming these terms and identifying them as ongoing systematic issues. And so, with that exhibition, we also had programming where we talked with policymakers and, had them sort of relate to the work. And so while I don't think that artists themselves are necessarily the policymakers for environmental justice and change and climate change, I always think of artists as sort of the soundtrack, to these things, and art as sort of a continual entry point into harder issues that we deal with.
Thank you. Anna Lopez is asking, having been a curator working outside of the institution and now working within the institution, what are the positive potentials of being an institutional curator while still perhaps being suspicious and or critical of art museums?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey. I think it's been almost 4 years in the institution. And I'm very thankful to learn the institution, the culture of the institution, how it works, just to have that information. I feel like it is, I think some of the great things about working in an institution is, obviously you have a budget that is more consistent, but also you're surrounded by really brilliant colleagues who I think just sort of fill you with like a wealth of knowledge and give you a larger scope of curating and other practices. I think for me right now, it feels important to be at the Hammer because, again, I'm such like a Angelino, and I feel like, the Hammer is free. And so I really see the potential in the Hammer as a space, as a civic space, and I often think about my curating as like being a civic servant. It's like I'm serving the various publics of this city. And so that really feels amazing to be sort of tethered to a site in that way and to continue to push that mission within. I think obviously in the wake of the summer, in the wake of the various open letters and calls and social media campaigns, I think museums as a whole have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work when it comes to addressing our colonial histories. And when it comes to addressing, I think, even our more contemporary histories in which, many museums started off as vanity projects for the wealthy elite. And so now what does it mean to make a space that comes from that legacy and to make it more open and generative and for it to represent, the people around that space? And so I think it's, it's like this continual work. I think in terms of suspicion, it's always good to be a little suspicious. And I think that suspicion has pushed me to push forward certain initiatives within the museum that fortunately have been accepted. So it's been a great space.
Awesome. Final question. And this comes from a longtime arts educator here in Miami, Lilia Garcia. She says, you're very mission oriented. Do you mentor young artists, or are you involved in working with emerging artists?
I actually didn't realize, but yeah, I guess very mission oriented. Yeah, it's like, I feel like mentorship is funny. Like I actually don't really have a mentor, at least in the art world, which I find interesting. And so I think for me, yes, I definitely do mentor, I think, other cultural producers and curators in the city. I'm constantly working with interns who are interested in curating. But, I think for me, my style of curating is very hands off, and I was talking to Linda Good Bryant recently, who's the founder of Jam just above Midtown. And she said this really incredible thing about mentorship and leadership. She basically said that, a good leader is someone who, or a good mentor is someone who's going to bring someone on and really not make a replica of themselves, but rather allow that person to sort of step into their own. And she said it's also going to be someone who knows that this person's practice as it develops may even dismantle your practice.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that that was so incredible. And I think it's something that I really stick to, which is, again, my mentorship is very hands off. It's very much about like sort of bringing in or enlivening what someone already has and just sort of pushing them in the right direction. And so that's why I think it's really important to sort of tell my larger history of how I became a curator, because, I had no clue that I was going to be doing this. I went to film school. I was in the critical studies program. I thought, maybe I was going to go in the entertainment industry, realized I didn't want to do that. There's a lot of sort of poking around until I came to this. And so, as museums and institutions are opening up more and accepting people who don't have, PhDs or even grad degrees, I think there's room for all of us. And, that's exciting.
That's awesome. Thank you for being so generous and thoughtful and open with your presentation and your question and answering the questions. A round of applause for Erin. Thank you so much. We have coming up our last talks of the season, of the 2020 season, with Nicholas Baum, who's the director of the New York Public Art Fund. That's November 11th. We'll see how we are feeling by then. Actually, am I getting my date right? Let me just double check. I'm in such a time slip. Yes, it's November 11th, just double checking. Erin, thank you so much. We're going to sign off of talks, but really appreciate. And when should we look for your shows that are coming up that you told us about in the last two slides?
They'll be in the fall. Okay. Fall of next year.
Next year. Great. Well, we hope to get you to Miami again soon. And until then, thank you and have a great night.
Thank you, guys.